There's a question that came actually into the live stream last week, which I kind of tried to handle, but you're much better at handling it, which was why more Formula One drivers aren't using driver coaches and why driver coaching in general is not really a big thing in Formula One. I semi-replied saying, well, of course, a lot of the race engineers try to try to coach the drivers and telling them what to do in turn 10 or brake later here or use more curb there or whatever. But that's, of course, that isn't really getting to the heart of the matter.
No, that's it's kind of coaching, I suppose. And you think, yeah, well, we've got to get the lines correct and get close to the apex, and we all kind of know that, and use up the road. We all know you've got to be over to the left if you've got a right-hand corner coming up, and someone else might be a fraction quicker than you in the middle of a corner, and so you could be informed of that. I suppose you'd call that coaching. I think more what I spend my time doing with drivers, and they are doing it, by the way, is the way you drive. And that's the biggest thing. Far more important than the lines. You can win on a couple of different lines. We know you want to get the car flat in places so it accelerates better. We know we want corners relatively short because cars go better when they're not going around corners. And so, but this is all, we used to be a bit radical talking like that 20, 30 years ago. Now, it's ABC. But more important than that is the rate you tell the car what's coming. The tiny introductions to the steering, the tiny introductions to the brake pedal. They talk about hit the brakes, but really, if you wanted something to move, if you had a couch, a sofa in your bedroom or in your living room, and you wanted to move that, you would not walk to the other side of the room and get running and run flat out across the room and bang into it and hit that couch to make it move. Yeah, it would move, but boy, there'd be a price you'd be paying for it. You'd be inching it forward. You do not go hitting the brakes. It sounds like it, but there should always be a minuscule introduction to these things. And getting drivers to move their body at a certain rate when you're going absolutely flat out, when you're staring death in the face, when you're on the complete limit, that's the gift of it. Getting them to be like that when they're in extreme circumstance.
Rob, one of the tools, of course, that they all go to for different reasons from driver to driver, team to team, is the simulator. Where are we at now with simulators, do you think, in terms of what you just described, that sort of detail, the nudging of the couch before you start to push it? Can simulators start to work in that direction, or are we still a long way away from that?
We're still a ways away from that. The simulators are great. They duplicate a lot of things. But I noticed that they talked at Monza that with Max, they went away from being slavishly, with their words, I think, stuck to the simulator and going with what the driver was feeling when they went to the setup. Now, that sounds radical. It should be common sense, but that's what they did. And they were happy with that. The simulator, obviously it's terrific in the way it can paint a picture, but it's still digital. So it can't be exactly 100% correct. If you've input a brake pedal or a steering wheel that's loading up the left front wheel on a right-hand corner, and in doing that in a minuscule way, that weight is not necessarily going to register on a digital readout, because if you push it it's all ones and twos. So if that weight's gone from 1 to 1.49, that line on the simulator is still reading 1. And if it goes from 1.49 to 1.51, just a fraction more, it'll read 2. But we're saying, what about 1.116 to 1.204? It can't be there. And yes, it makes a big difference in the way that a car handles. So that I don't think can really show up. And most of the things on these cars, they're kind of reactive, whereas drivers have got to anticipate. And that comes from the driver, not from a simulator.
What is a Rob Wilson day like now, Rob? What circuits do you tend to favour? What cars are you using? You still in road cars, manual transmission, I guess?
Yeah, using Ford Puma, which is a terrific car. It's an amazingly well balanced car that even though it's front wheel drive, um, it wears its tyres evenly. It doesn't wear out its fronts more than it does its rears, which is quite unusual. So very, very well balanced car. And so using that, using Bedford, Jonathan Palmer's place, and also Hessel, which is the Lotus test track just north of Snetterton. And then I use a little bit of Goodwood, and also at Donington, the old part of the old original 1933 Formula One track, which is still there, in part, and that's great. It swoops downhill and comes up. There used to be photographs of old Mercedes and Auto Unions with their wheels in the air. We've got that corner there. We've got that on that track. It's quite interesting. We don't leave the ground very much because nevertheless it's there. So we use pretty much those small places, and that's enough for me because fronting is closed now. That's now car storage. So that's what I've been doing, and it works very well.
Rob, you've also in the past done some rally drivers. Can you talk a little bit about that and the relevance of what you specialise in to rallying?
Yeah, but mind you, it's not hugely different. Like you drive at Indianapolis, and there are two things, and then you drive in a rally, and there are 20 dynamics going on. But it still comes down to keeping the corners as short as we can, not overdoing the Scandinavian flick. A little introduction to the steering and the rate you decrease the brake can be just about as effective as a Scandinavian flick. Not having corners going on too long. They're very, very similar. And of course, the rally drivers, they've got to be a bit more creative because you can never find the ultimate cornering speed because, it's always a bit of a mystery. But they get jolly close. But no, I don't. There's very little difference. And I do a number of the rally drivers. In fact, I got a message from Gus Greensmith just the other day who did so well with Ford and various other themes that I must get back to him.
Rob, can we just talk a little bit more about that reference you made to, well, I think you're making a reference to left foot braking and what's achievable without left foot braking if you use the brakes perfectly. Is that correct? Is that the right way of posing the question?
Yes, that's right. And I know some famous rally drivers, Finnish, who I worked with, who did ask me about that, and kind of agreed that left foot braking wasn't that essential. Now cars are often two pedal these days, so you use your left foot, but originally people were thinking, well, you can come off the brake and be on the throttle immediately or at the same time. But there's actually a value in the gap, and people have discovered that when they go for lift and coast, particularly at Le Mans, that if you can come off the throttle, that's already beginning to transfer weight to the front. And then you can go on the brake and continue that weight transfer in a seamless way. There's not always a value in being the first off the throttle and onto the brake, or even off the brake and onto the throttle. There's a value in the gap sometimes, but the drivers need to give themselves their own example. Till I show them, they then do it themselves, and then when they've given themselves their own examples of this, that's when the learning process begins, and rather than just talking about it. And so, you do not have to be the world's fastest with your feet.
On that subject, and something we've noticed with Lando, particularly over the last 12 months, but occasionally Max, sometimes Oscar, is that going into fast corners, particularly Lando, there's a it's under a second, but there is a moment when he's on neither the throttle or the brakes, and the car's just floating in without either pedal being touched. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. There's a lot of times we go over a race where neither of those pedals is being used. You can say, sometimes you're racing a Porsche, you've always got to keep some sort of energy going through it. You coming off the throttle and onto the brake pretty much at the same time, or off the brake and on that throttle almost at the same time. You tend to have to keep some energy in there, but it's a bit of a Porsche thing. In normal racing, or the rest of the racing, no, it's okay for waiting for the car to rotate for a moment. And that could be the length of time you stay off the throttle, or the length of time you stay off the brake, or how much throttle you put on, or you're driving the car with your feet, obviously, as much as you can, but that can mean just allowing it to rotate sometimes. That's not a bad thing.
Your latest single, which is obviously the most important thing in your life at the moment. Let's talk about that.
Well, it's called Norway, Maine. When our band goes to America, which it does generally every year, we've been playing in Maine, which is north of Boston, about 3-hour drive, state of Maine. And there's a town there called Norway. And in that town, where we play at the Oxford County Fair and a few gigs locally, there's a radio station called WOXO, and it covers a lot of Maine. And someone kind of jokingly suggested, write a song about Norway, Maine. It's a small American town. So we did, and we recorded it.
Brilliant.
In Mark Knopfler's studio, actually. Remember Mark from Dire Straits? So we recorded it there, and we only did it, a week or so ago, and we sent it across to them, and I think they like it. They started playing it on the radio station. So there it is, Norway, Maine, small town story, like a Tulsa time, except you're coming back to the town. You're not leaving it.